We're delighted to welcome you to the Darbar Hall of the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol. It is our pleasure to present today Biographers Ball, Samanth Subramanian, Ira Mukhoty and Srinivas Reddy in conversation with Anita Anand. How do you grasp another life and pin it to a page? What does it take to immerse yourself completely into someone else's story, to comb through history and bring it alive? Biographers of luminaries and figures as illustrious as JBS Haldane, Akbar, Krishna Devaraya and Udham Singh come together in a panel to discuss what it means to bring the larger to life compellingly and authentically, and the challenges they face in doing so. In conversation with broadcaster and author of The Patient Assassin, Anita Anand. Samanth Subramanian is an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, BusinessWeek, Granta, Wired and Harper's. His most recent work, A Dominant Character, is a biography of the scientist and communist JBS Haldane. Ira Mukhoty is the author of Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queen and Begums of the Mughal Empire. Heroines, powerful Indian women in myth and history. Her most recent book is Akbar, the Great Mughal, and she is currently working on a text around the women of Mahabharata due to be released this year. Srinivas Reddy is a scholar, translator and musician. He studied classical South Asian languages and literature at UC Berkeley and currently teaches at Brown University and IIT Gandhinagar. He is also a concert sitarist and spends his time performing, teaching and conducting research around the world. Anita Anand is a political broadcaster with the BBC. In 2015, she published the acclaimed Sophia, Princess Suffragette, Revolutionary and 2 years later, Kohinoor, which she co-authored with William Dalrymple. Her latest is The Patient Assassin. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Biographers Ball, Samanth Subramanian, Ira Mukhoty and Srinivas Reddy in conversation with Anita Anand. Over to you, Anita.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely and comprehensive introduction. Because we are in such strange times, it might be useful to tell you where we're all sitting right now, because this truly is a global JLF this year. So Srinivas is in Providence in Rhode Island, Ira is in Delhi, and Samanth and I are both down the road from each other in London. What strange times we are living in. Let's first of all just acknowledge how bizarre this is to be meeting in this way, and how lockdown can be actually the friend of a writer and also its arch enemy. Srinivas, how have you found lockdown?
Well, to be honest, as hard as it has been in many ways, I also feel like I've had a really amazing time during this period to go deep into myself and focus on things that are the most important things in my life. So I think it's also made me feel very grateful for what I have and what, you know, the universe has given me. So
well,
it's been good.
You are, as the introduction suggests, something of a polymath with the heart of a poet. When I sort of got in touch with you for the first time, I asked you where you were and you said, I'm in a place where the rivers meet the sea. So I sort of feel that even if somebody dropped you in a dark well, you would make the best of it. Ira, what about you? How's it been for you?
Well, I have to admit to being less generous in my, in the way I went through the lockdown, I suppose primarily because my last book was published right in the middle of it through, a completely accidental process, which was inevitable as well. So, it got published and came out and everything was shut. There were no bookstores, were not open, nothing was functioning. So it was very heartbreaking, as any writer I'm sure will empathize, to have a big book, which I'd spent several years on, to be just launched into what seemed like a vacuum. So yeah, I'm pretty bitter about that. But in more specific ways as a writer, I found, to my surprise, because I consider myself an introvert, I spend my time at my desk, but not having that option to go and immerse myself in the lives of others, which I do pretty regularly. I take the metro and go into Old Delhi and just wander around and just wander around. Writers are eavesdroppers and voyeurs in the lives of others. So I found that not having that was actually very shackling for me as a writer. So I must say I didn't enjoy it one bit.
Yeah, Samanth, what about you?
Yeah, I know writers are supposed to say that lockdown has been great for getting a lot of writing done. It's not great for having you love the process of writing. I mean, I think it was Hitchens who said that the best thing about writing all day was to look forward to the glass of wine in the evening with your friends, or for people to come over for dinner and you can actually have some human company once more. I had none, and so as a result of it, at the end of 2020, I absolutely detested being a writer. If somebody had offered me a job in a hedge fund, I would have taken it in a heartbeat.
Yeah, it has been. I mean, Ira, you sort of touched on what I want to ask next, because I've done a few of these biographer balls now for JLF, and I have to say, don't tell them because they'll stop asking me. I love these more than anything that I do, because I think biographers are the strangest breed of human that exists. There's a strange mixture of nerdiness, nosiness, and naughtiness that goes into making a biographer, and just give them this sort of feeling that they have the right to delve into people's lives in such depth, and the chutzpah to go through their dirty laundry and pull things out. What is it about you, Ira, first of all, that led you to think, actually, biography is for me? Because it really isn't for everybody.
No, I think it was utter foolishness, to be honest with you, Anita, at least this particular biography on Akbar, because he's such a talismanic figure, and a figure on which there is so much information available. Now, what I had worked on until this point were the histories of women. And it was completely different when I was looking at material to write a book about women. I had to literally take on the role almost of a medieval detective and put together architectural findings, a stray line here or there, a poem perhaps that somebody mentioned. There was almost nothing. They had almost been made invisible. So I had the opposite problem when I approached Akbar, for whom there's really a veritable landslide of information available. But luckily for me, one of the first things I came across when I was reading Abu al-Fazl, who was the great biographer, hagiographer, friend, enthusiast of Akbar, and a lot of his writings tend to be solely, very overinflated and positive. But luckily I came across what at the end, I think it's volume 3 of the Ani Akbari, and he has a section called The Happy Sayings of the Emperor. And these are actual literal transcriptions of things that Akbar said. And reading through them, I initially thought, okay, these will be overwhelming. They'll be really ponderous and, wonderful things that the emperor has said. And that's not really the case. He says, he does say some very deep and insightful things, but he also says some pretty banal and mundane stuff about everyday activities. And interestingly, he questions a lot of things. So he'll say things like, why do men insist on sati for their women? Why must they prove their love for their husband by committing sati? Why is circumcision of children necessary in Islam? How does that prove anything? So a lot of questioning about everything he saw around him. And that sort of immediately gave me an idea of the direction that my book would take, which would be, an evolution.
Yeah. I mean, we are going to get into the books in more detail in a moment, but it's really what I think people who are watching this, who may have aspirations to do what we do and what we clearly enjoy as much as we do. What is it about the writer that makes you want to write about a personality? Now, Srinivas, for example, you have such a rich background of music and poetry and translation. To be pulled into this particular slipstream, what happened?
Well, this was really just a very natural extension out of my thesis work, because I translated Krishnadevaraya's great poem. So I think, like the naughtiness and the intimacy that you were talking about, I think is really great, because even when you read someone else's work, when you read someone else's poetry and when you translate it, there is a certain kind of, intimacy that you develop with that person. You really feel like you're getting into their mind and heart. And so it was a natural kind of thing to write a biography. And also because I think, unlike other kind of great figures, we actually had like poetic work and authors, literature that the king had written. So that was like an important source that I think I brought to the whole endeavor of telling his story.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, I'll bounce back to you, Ira, in a second, but just in your case, this is part of the rich cultural tapestry of your family and your identity. as well. Now, that proximity to the flame, is that helpful or unhelpful, Srinivas?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a Telugu speaker, and it was, but you know, again, I think maybe back to what you were saying earlier, the other part was that Krishnadevaraya was this kind of multi-talented guy and had different interests, and he was a musician too. And I think that maybe, you know, made me feel more akin to how he saw the world in kind of a poetic way. I think in this case, though, it helped me. I mean, when I finished the book, both my gurus said, you know, I think you were Krishnadevaraya in an earlier life. Like you are this guy. So I don't know. Maybe I was too close. And I do paint a pretty, I think, you know, fantastic, wonderful, glorious kind of picture of this man. But I do really admire him, I have to say, and I think that comes out probably in my writing.
When it does. Samanth, your trajectory is similar to my own in that sort of journalism is the bread and butter. How did it change gear from writing sort of, you know, small pieces, factual pieces, to something which is actually pretty audacious to do for any writer?
Well, it's sort of, I mean, anybody who's worked on what you might call feature journalism, to very broadly, knows sort of the appeal of putting a human being at the heart of your story and to kind of depict the life or even a slice of the life of another human being. And then from there, you enlarge your canvas to the magazine profile, and you're given 5,000 or 6,000 words. I once got 16,000 words to write about somebody, and still that is not enough. And you still feel that there's so much more meat that is begging to be picked off this bone. And so eventually you come to write a single volume biography. And as I've discovered for this book, even a single volume biography doesn't feel like it's enough. Maybe the thing to do is really to write multi-volume biographies. And so the ambition to understand as fully as possible the nature of another human being and the circumstances and how personality and temperament interact with circumstances, I think is sort of endless. The quest is never ending, and the fascination never ceases to wane.
But you know, this, if we think about it in terms of topography, you know, there are some, Ira, you were saying, you know, some of the people that you've written about and the people that have fascinated me before, particularly with women who fall through the cracks so very readily. You are digging down to find somebody and show them to the world. With Akbar, and you just sort of started to allude to this, it is a mountain of information that you are having to scale. Now, that vastness of information, not least mythology. I mean, I grew up in this country. I'm an Essex girl, in fact. For anyone who is on this side of the world, you'll know where that is. But, you know, I even grew up with Akbar Birbal stories. That was something I knew. You know, I remember watching Anarkali. You know, there is so much mythologizing with that particular name. So when you're sort of standing at the foot of this enormous mountain, how do you even begin to say, right, okay, I've got two piles now, myth, reality, myth. How do you start? How do you even start?
It's really difficult. I think the starting point is Abu al-Fazl. You know, he's the great biographer, contemporary biographer of Akbar, and he has written so much about him. So you do start with him, but by the time you finish, you just think that this cannot be the only picture of Akbar. But surely he was more complicated than just this perfect human being. And as I was saying, you know, as I began with saying that the sayings of Akbar actually showed him as an evolving human being, and that is what I decided to then focus on, to show him in 6 different stages of his life through 10 decades each, and show how he evolved as a human being. And so one of, like, there are many sources. There are the myths around him, the Akbar Birbal, the Jodha Akbar stories, all of that. Luckily, we also have a very valuable source in this Persian writer called Badauni, who was a translator at Akbar's court, and who was highly critical of him. He didn't like the way Islam was turning under Akbar at all. He wanted the more orthodox version. And he was very, very depressed at the way things were turning out. So we have this wonderful and critical biography, which I can then use to complement Abu al-Fazl. And then there are the writings of the people who were, say, conquered by Akbar. So the Rajput writings in Braj Bhasha, say, the Jain writings and the Sikh writings. And these are also, a wonderful complement. And the last thing I wanted to touch upon was a resource that is now available to us, are the miniature paintings. somehow, art history sometimes is not taken in the same vein as regular historical writing, but I found it hugely informative for me for the sort of narrative history that I wanted to write for people, so that I could imagine the lived space within which this emperor was evolving. So for example, if we can show the first slide, Anubhav, the very first one of the Kumarga hunt. So for example, I wanted to write about some of the great battles that Akbar fought. Now, being a 21st century urban woman, I have very little experience of direct combat or anything of the sort. And I figured nor would my readers know a great deal. And yet I wanted them to experience these battles in battle condition, to sort of hear the noises and understand, the fear and everything surrounding it. And for that, I used a lot of the miniature paintings, like this one that you can see here from the Akbar Nama. And it shows a thing called the Kumarga hunt. Now, when the writers write about it, they just say the famous ring hunt was carried out, the Kumarga hunt was carried out, with not a great deal of explanation. But this image, which shows the Emperor Akbar in the middle on his horse, hunting this group of animals which have been corralled in this small space in a ring. And you see the sort of violence, you can almost hear the screaming of the animals. You can see the women who accompany Akbar, and that is not mentioned in the writings, that the women actually go everywhere. So right in the middle, you have the women's tent, you have the eunuch sitting at the door of the tent, all these little details that a painter thinks to put in. And these are painters who accompanied the emperor everywhere he went, so they would have seen this firsthand. So things like, this miniature painting, if I can show just the second one, I won't take more time because there's not much time. Could we have the second one as well? Yes, so they often talk about, how India is a land of rivers, and often the army had to cross rivers, and they just casually mention a bridge of boats was constructed. There were no bridges there most of the time, so a bridge of boats. Now, what was a bridge of boats? I just couldn't get my head around it. But in this painting, this famous painting from the Akbar Nama, you can see how boats are slashed together and so strongly held that actually elephants, in this case, they are in must, they are angry, they can actually run across this river, this boat, bridge of boats without it, collapsing. So many such details came to me so that I could make this text more alive for a reader in today's 21st century condition.
And you certainly do. I mean, some of your descriptions, and I don't mean to sound frivolous, but they have stayed mouth-wateringly with me. The kind of things that were on the man's table, are quite apart from what he did and what he accomplished and what people said about him. You do make that very visceral and real. Samanth, if I can come to you next, because we shouldn't take it for granted that people will know who Haldane is. In his time, as famous, is it fair to say, as Einstein? But these days, not so much. So in a nutshell, tell us about this extraordinary character that drew you.
Well, I first heard about Haldane backwards, so to speak. I heard that he was a British scientist who had died in India, lived and died there. And that intrigued me because usually we associate the movement of scientists as being from India to the West rather than the other way around. And so I was curious about this guy who decided to move to Calcutta in 1957 and settled in India. And the more you find out about him, the more he fascinates you. There's a lot of his work in genetics that is quite obviously important, and that should be written about in its own right. But he had the most dramatic life. He wrote his first paper in the trenches in the First World War. He became a member of the Communist Party and was suspected of being a spy for the Soviets. He was relentlessly anti-establishment. He was in Spain during the Civil War a bunch of times. He experimented on himself during the Second World War. So the thick drama of this life, what was sort of most attractive to me about it was how it melded these spheres of science and politics, which I think we've forgotten that science is actually a genuinely political activity that people carry out. We just think of it as this sort of pristine, objective sphere of analysis, but actually it's incredibly subject to the political and social currents of its time. And I think Haldane thought about all of this stuff extensively, and he had plenty of lessons for us, I think, to think through. But that sounds like a very boring thing to say, that the book is supposed to be didactic in some reason. I think the primary reason I wanted to write it was because of the lush and cinematic nature of his adventures, which I think is just impossible to even read the Wikipedia entry about his life and not be immediately entranced.
I mean, the man at times sounds like a complete nutter. You sort of mentioned about the trenches. And this was a man who had been reared as almost like a lab rat for his dad's experiments, a willing lab rat for his dad's experiments. And there he is in the trenches of the First World War, where people are dying and being blown to bits around him, and a shell lands near him, and he is excited. And doesn't he write, at last, at long last. It sort of gives the measure of an unusual mind, shall we say.
I think that's right. I mean, I think he's in many ways a biographer's dream, in the sense that there's so much to describe about his life. And yet here he was, this man with a rich sort of intellectual life, who thought so deeply about the ethical and scientific issues of his time. So it's really sort of, the best of both worlds.
With Srinivas, Krishnadeva-Raya, for those, and I'm sort of acutely aware that we have an international audience for this, which is wonderful. So in India, he doesn't take much explanation, but for those who maybe don't know so well, he's credited with one of the most glorious empires that India has ever known, a short one. But if you run your fingers, I mean, I said to Ira, it's like Akbar is like looking up at a mountain. Run your fingers over the south of India, it's like Braille. You can read the story of Krishnadeva-Raya in temples and ruins and beautiful things that are left behind. Tell us more about why he matters.
Great question. I think he matters because he's at this critical moment in global history, particularly Indian history. This is right when the Portuguese arrive. This is when, Western colonialism is about to start. We have sultans, we have Hindu kings, we have North relations, we have South relations. I mean, it's this really interesting 1500 nexus moment. So I think he's critical in that sense, just because of his position in history and time. And also, as I'd mentioned, because he wasn't just an administrator, he wasn't just a king, he was a poet, he was a musician, he was a philosopher. And I think his perspective on what governance ought to be and could be is a really important lesson that we could probably learn a lot from today as our leaders move forward and as we all move forward as this very multicultural, globalized planet. So I think in that sense, he's very, very relevant to today. And if I could just add one quick thing about, we were talking about the myth and history, because there's lots of parallels between Krishnadeva-Raya and Akbar, but the material we have, a lot of it is from Portuguese chronicles and this and that. But when I put those sources together, and I think it's popular now to kind of look at myth and history, maybe even on a continuum, which is a little bit of a step up from how we used to look at it. I mean, myth was just out. You couldn't use that for history. Now it's like, okay, I have myths, I have this, I have this. But even more than a continuum, I see it as this constellation of stuff, because I wouldn't put anything on kind of a continuum of historicity. Like this is more historical or less historical. So if you take Abu Fazl or Peddana, who is the court chronicler for Krishnadeva, I mean, when you actually read those guys, you kind of get a picture that they're probably the least accurate of all the people telling the story, because they have some serious agendas to take care of. They have to praise their king, they have to be really nice. And so it's interesting when you put all this stuff together. I think you can come up with kind of a more kind of holistic picture of what's going on, even in terms of the sources. So
well, it's interesting. And so one of the marvelous things about being able to do this is that I understand completely what you're talking about with Udham Singh. In India, those who know the name will know this great mythology of a man who stood in the blood-soaked earth of Jallianwala Bagh and picks up a handful of earth and rubs it across his head and says, I'm going to kill the men responsible no matter how long it takes and no matter where it takes me. Now, that is hugely hagiographic. It's massive. And I found that whenever I was doing research into that particular person, the more lofty and hyperbolic the description, the less likely it was to be true. And often it was in sort of the mundane that you found the truth. And the truth was even more extraordinary than the mythology, but you just had to delve into something that seemed quite boring. In your case with Haldane, I think it's a similar sort of experience that Special Branch, the IPI and MI5 did a lot of the work for us. Not that we ever got to see it or were ever meant to see it. But didn't you say that MI5 sort of wrote the first unofficial biography of Haldane? And tell us a bit more about that.
That's right. I mean, MI5 started keeping tabs on Haldane, believing he was a spy. Sometime in the 1930s, they compiled 2 decades worth of files about him, which would include mundane things like he returned from Calais on a boat and we searched his baggage and there wasn't anything of interest to be found in there, to intercepted letters, to accounts of speeches that he gave and things like that. But
you should say they were interested in him because of his communism, because he
was first sliding towards communism, then became a card-carrying member of the party, and so they thought his loyalties lay with the Soviets. And the file only became public from the National Archives a couple of decades ago, maybe a decade and a half ago. So I got quite lucky, and I only discovered it midway through my research process. So you can imagine my glee when I downloaded these documents. But it really was sort of one other agency's patient accumulation and an attempt by MI5 to peek into the personality and the loyalties of this man. And I greatly appreciated the work they'd done on my behalf. I didn't have to do a lot of it. It was a kind of bonus where, because they had actually bugged the Communist Party headquarters in London. And so every time Haldane came to visit, there would actually be a transcript of the conversation he had with his party comrades. And you know what it's like. I mean, to stumble upon dialogue from that era and to kind of be able to recreate a scene is just the greatest gift.
Completely, utterly. I should say the structure of this, for those of you, and I know many of you are going to be itching to ask questions, which will be wonderful. Just start thinking of your questions, and you can enter them in chat. That would be brilliant, and we will come to you in about roughly about 10 minutes time. So what I love, I mean, since we're talking about sources and myth busting, we've touched on this. Ira, we all often hear sort of Akbar presented as the anti-Aurangzeb, the man who was so sensitive and so secular. And yet you have put some warts in here. I mean, one that sticks in my head is was it the defenestration of a servant for something quite minor, or he threw him from a tower? You know, there's sort of there's grit in the oyster. Just tell us a little more about sort of the reality versus the mythology.
Right. Yes, exactly. So, that's what I wanted to show when I realized, of course, like anybody else, that this is a human being who has evolved in his life, who has learned things, from the many experiences he's had. I wanted people to see that. I wanted to see it, for them to see this very clear trajectory of a man who was not born great the way Abu al-Fazl would want us to believe, but he went through, many challenges and had some different views. In the beginning, for example, he admits to having converted prisoners of war to Islam forcibly, and later on in his life he writes about it and say, I regret that so much, but that is the process he went through. In the beginning, he married a great number of women because he wanted to expand into the territories that they held, so he married many Rajput princesses. And later on, at the famous Ibadat Khana discussions, one of the first questions he brought up was, how many women am I lawfully allowed to marry? He was very worried by the fact that he had married so many women and what was their status under Islamic law. He was worried for them, and he regretted once again having married so many women. And he started announcing that polygamy was prohibited, that young girls should not get married, they should wait till rules protecting women. So that happened over time. Similarly, initially he was admiring of women who committed sati. He thought, wow, what a wonderful expression of their love for their husbands. And then later on, he was actually directly involved in a woman who was being forced to commit sati, and he rode out to stop her, to save her life. And he realized that this was horrifying, that women were actually being forced most of the time. And he tried to outlaw sati, though he didn't, because he was aware of the Hindu sensitivity of his courtiers. So through these many incidents, I try and show that he was not this perfect man like none of us, is, and that he made mistakes. He failed again and again, but he surrounded himself with a lot of good people who advised him, and he himself used his experience to try and become a better person. So it wasn't, so I hope the reader gets that sense of the evolution of the man.
Yeah, and you have already pointed out the parallels, Srinivas, with Akbar and Krishnadevaraya. So this sort of the humble beginnings is something that is very much present in your character, and I'm saying character as in a real life character. What were the warts? Because you have very honestly said, you loved the man, You were brought up to love the man. You have affinity. You might have been the man in a past life. I mean, who knows? But where were the warts in your character?
Well, well, that's funny that you say that, because it's very rare to have physical description of kings or anybody of this period in Indian history. But they talk about how his face was pockmarked because he must have suffered smallpox. That's one of the descriptions we have, which is, of course, in great contrast to the nice statues that we see of him as a very beautiful fellow. I mean, so yeah, he he had that. I think the greatest thing, and I tried to bring this out, also is in that kind of evolution of his character, is that his undefeated record in battle, his amazing gloriousness, it all got to his head, and he did some really uncouth things towards the end of his reign that were, I think, brought out by a certain kind of megalomania. And I think that was his greatest downfall. His glory was his greatest downfall. That was it.
Samanth with Haldane, I mean, you almost sort of take as your pivot point, one of the nadirs in his life, one of the lowest points in his life, which was the Lysenko affair. Just tell us a little bit about that, and how you managed to stay holding his hand even through that, and to get through the other side.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of describe the affair briefly, this was an incident where Haldane was called upon to choose between his scientific integrity and his political loyalty. And it was the one time he made the wrong choice. It was the one time he chose his political loyalty and paid a price for it, and possibly disappointed himself as much as his fellow scientists. But I thought it was an interesting inflection point, because it marks sort of this. It, of course, exemplifies this constant tussle in his life between his science and his politics, his two great loves. But it also, I think, to choose a moment like that is to be able to, if I tried to explain why he made the decision that he did, I felt we would understand JBS much better. We would understand the influences that had shaped him. We would understand the phase in his life he was at that moment, and we would understand the outcome of that, what happened to him over the next 25 odd years. These pivot points are quite interesting, and because you really want it to say as much as it can, but you don't want to make the classic biographer's mistake of thinking that everything in a life can be explained through this one pivot point. And so and of course, this is something that shows Haldane in a poor light, and you have to balance that out with the urgent need to actually have your reader like Haldane as much as you do. And I think, as most biographers will admit, that they finish their books and come away with a genuine affection and fondness for the person they've just written about.
We have questions now, and I'm delighted. People have loved everything that you've had to say. This is kind of a little bit left field, but why not? Let's start with something that's slightly left field. Jessica has asked, and Ira, you can take this first. If you were, any of you, hypothetically, it's very caveated, to write a biography on Trump, what would you call it? Ira, first of all.
Oh gosh, never again, I think.
Never again. That's very quick thinking. Very quick thinking. Okay, let's start. Srinivas, what about you?
I don't know. Are you saying I'd write the biography and I'd have to title it?
Yeah, yes.
Oh dear, I don't know. The Orange Clown? I don't know, whatever.
Okay. Saman.
The title would be Kofefe. The subtitle would be America's Descent into Nonsense.
Yes, good. Very good. Are you working on that? You sound
that sounds about right.
pretty much thought out. Zara has been in touch. This is particularly, Ira, for you. Akbar's life has been extremely well documented through the ages. Not much there's forayed into popular literature. How long ago did you locate the void? And was the primary reason behind taking up this project that you needed to fill the gap?
Yes. So I think unlike England, which has a very good tradition of historical writing, so every year, for example, in the last 20 years, every year there has been a new book on Elizabeth I. Over here, we haven't had that sort of discourse. We haven't had that sort of attention put on some of the figures who have really shaped our history, our country. So definitely, that was one of the reasons that I took up Akbar, that there's a lot of myth making, as you were saying, there are the Akbar Birbal stories, the Jodha Akbar, a lot of false narratives now that are being put out there. So I thought it was really essential to take one of these figures, and because I have been studying the Mughals, Akbar came to mind, because he was really this pivotal figure over which everything, a sort of fulcrum over which everything then changed. And I thought it would be really interesting to study it, to write it in a form as accessible as possible for the lay reader, because historians obviously know all that I have to say, but a lot of lay readers don't. So that was definitely, it's a good question, and definitely one of the reasons I took this up.
Emma, Srinivas, maybe you could take this. How important is academic training in history to write a biography?
Oh, that's a big question. At least for me, I mean, I don't know about academic, because I think that word is really loaded. And I think, to be quite frank, I feel like academia is moving in a direction that I haven't been so excited about. But I think training in writing and various other skills are really important. For me, particularly, I think being able to read multiple Indian languages in the original is really important, especially because, when you're working on historical figures, a lot of times we rely on translations of, works that people of that time wrote or were written about them. And those translations come through certain biases and certain lenses of the translator. So if you can go back to the original and really read the sources in the original languages, I think that can really clarify or sharpen your perspective on these really critical, the foundation of how we even learn about these people. So yeah, I think academic training is important, but I think it's also a bit overrated sometimes. And I think, academic writing is not for the public. I wanted to have all the apparati of an academician in the book as there is, but I wanted to write a book that people would like to read without having to have all that.
My journalistic ear picked up on something, which is, academia is moving in a direction you don't like. Tell me more, Srinivas.
Well, I mean, it's like so super specialized. It's the further you can get from an engagement with the public, it's like the better. It's like everything is so. This is a big discussion we had, but it's just so jargon based. It's so based on what this person said and that person said in this paper and that thing, and we're losing a sense of the stuff. The there of academic work is lost. Like in the old days, like even in my discipline, you could translate a text and write about it, and that would be a thesis. Today, you can't do that. Today, you have to translate the text, write about it, and then talk about all this theoretical stuff that gives it relevance. So I think we're getting lost in the kind of meta discussion and really losing a sense of basic stuff. I mean, you talk to scholars today, they don't even know like basic stuff about their own discipline. I mean, you said, for example, that Krishnadeva Raya is even well known in India. Well, he's not actually. There's a lot of people that don't even know about Krishnadeva Raya, especially in North India. A lot of people don't know about Vijayanagara. We Indians don't know our history so well. Academics of South Asia, even when they train well, don't know much about South India often. So like there's a lot that's going on. Sorry, I'm talking a lot about this, but it's a bit, we should have a panel about this.
We really should. I just felt there was an itch that desperately needed a scratch just there, and I was right. So if the programmers of JLF want to take note for next time. Samanth, you and I have different chops. We don't have the historian chops going on, but we have the journo gene, don't we? So how does that, help you go about your business?
Well, I mean, it helps. It definitely helps. Sort of the research of a journalist is quite distinct from the research of an academician, but it can be nonetheless rigorous. And so I think, the multiplicity of sources that you consult, the fact checking, I mean, all of this is quite journalistic. But I think what helps us is our unending desire to be as vivid as possible for the reader, and to set up scenes, and to set up characters, and to bring forth as faithfully as possible the drama of real life. And I think I don't know about you, Anita, but I always think in terms of scenes. I always think in terms of setting somebody down in a physical location. If there's two people talking to each other, even better. And so I think from the point of view of writing for a lay audience, the desire to be that vivid is a distinct advantage.
Yeah, what Kabir is sort of building on that and has asked both of us, and maybe I'll take a bit of this, is how is biographical writing different from other journalism work? I mean, partly, I suppose, the difference is that when I'm doing journalism, I'm able to talk to people who are alive. You know, you have that same interrogating thing, but they are there, they are flesh and blood, and you can look in their eyes, and you can sometimes tell when they're lying. When you are doing this kind of writing, and I don't know, this may be true for all of us, is you are still interviewing people, but they're dead. So you're sort of, you know, you are having to ask those questions. And I do find myself when I find sources, you know, in dusty boxes, and often with the kind of thing that I write about, these are dusty boxes in people's attics that have been forgotten about. And you just read something, you go, now, why did you say that? It's exactly what you would say if they were in a chair in front of you, Samanth. And I find that is the thing that I can often go on great quests which lead me nowhere, but I treat every source as if it's a person that is to be partially believed and mostly disbelieved. You know,
I think that's right. I mean, I think, like, obviously there's no chance at a follow-up question, which is disturbing and unsettling. But equally, there is a certain liberation in knowing that there's just so much material out there. You can't go beyond this. There are no further truths to excavate beyond that. Whatever truths you bring to the book are the ones that you come up with while you're writing the book itself.
We have a few minutes left. This is a beautiful question from Kate, and I'll throw it to you, Srinivas, but maybe if all of you can think about your answer. Kate says, given the enormity of archival material that is available, how do you figure out what should go in the book and what do you leave on the cutting room floor? She says, using a film analogy, but you know what she means, Srinivas.
Yeah. No, I mean, I have stacks and stacks of Word documents with stuff that are my cutting room floor. So that's a great question. I think for me, in this book particularly, it's put a bunch of interesting stuff into notes. So if, like, the interested reader wants to know, they can kind of reference notes. But otherwise, it was more about what is going to help further the narrative in, like, a somewhat linear arc and motion. And so you have to make decisions, and you have to, you know, decide what is your story that you're going to tell. Am I going to tell the story just about a king? Am I going to tell a story about an administrator? Am I going to tell the story about a poet? And so I think really being clear on the arc that you want to create defines what makes it in or not. So
okay,
that's a great question, though.
Yeah, very good question. Ira, what about for you?
I missed the first half of the question when you froze. So is it
okay? So what? How do you decide what goes in the book and what you just throw on the floor?
Right. Well, there was a lot of throwing on the floor in my case because, you know, my sources was. After I published the book, every time I came across something, I thought, oh, shoot, I should have added this to it. This is something I didn't know about. There's so much material. But as Srinivas was saying, I think it has to be something which adds to the narrative. And in my case, something which added some knowledge to the character of Akbar or the people around him.
Okay, you're freezing a little bit, so forgive me, Ira, but I think we get the gist of what you say. Samanth, to you, same question.
I think I agree with Srinivas. I think once you have a really watertight structure and an outline, and you know the direction in which your story is going, it's actually much easier to discard a lot of material, which may be rich. It just doesn't fit into the story and the arguments that you're making.
We have 1 minute left, so just please crystallize this. But the one that got away, the biggest obstacle, or the thing that you still think is out there that you haven't found yet, Srinivas.
Well, just like yesterday, they discovered this inscription in Tumkur, outside of Tumkur, about the exact date when Krishnadeva died. So I guess what the big thing for me is there's just knowing that there's tons of stuff still out there that you know, our archaeological evidence or our, you know, archival research just hasn't knowing that there's stuff out there is what kind of gets me.
I'm pushing you because time is against us. Ira, the missing manuscript, what is it that where's the gap? And when it, you know, the thing that you wish you'd found?
again, it comes to the point that I have so much information here that I could use from. So I don't see a particular gap. I would have liked to have had
Very lucky.
Akbar's word himself, but he was
You are-
not. He could
Yeah.
not.
Okay, Summer?
There's an anecdote about JBS that somebody asked him, what do you know about the creator? And JBS said, if there is a creator, he has an inordinate fondness for beetles because there's so many beetle species. I have not until today been able to pin down the source of this quote. It has, annoyed me no end, but there is just no answer out there. I don't know when he said it, where he wrote it. Impossible.
Great quote. And for me, it's just, just as Samanth was saying, sometimes MI5 can be very helpful, but they're the papers that you don't know where they're filed. There, there's a wealth of surveillance about the kind of people I write about that's out there somewhere in a box under some really obscure heading that I have not yet identified. This has been an absolute pleasure. This is why I love doing Biographers balls. This is why you're my favorite people to get stuck in a lift with. Thank you very much indeed to all the panelists here, to Samanth and to Srinivas. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Samanth, Ira, Mr. Reddy and Anita for an insightful conversation. It was truly wonderful. We'd also like to thank our celebration partner Diageo for their support. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please do stay logged on to continue to watch with us the stellar list of speakers and sessions that we've specially curated for you. Do remember to pick up your copy of the book from the Amazon bookstore online. Do remember to tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 and tag us at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you in our other sessions both in the Darbar Hall and the front lawn.